Thanks, Trevor. Thanks for inviting me here. My approach is going to be pretty simple. Geopolitics of fossil fuels just involves really in this day and age, the interests of US in the Middle East. So here is a summary chart with all the interactions. Everybody get it? Got it? Good? Okay. End of talk. That's it. So now we can move on to our wonderful evening supper provided by Hap. I think he's got like Yeti cheese and Sasquatch crackers, and my favorite, which is butterfly cookies. And of course, we know why they're called butterfly cookies, right? Got them here. Anyone knows why they're called butterfly cookies? That's one answer. They look like butterflies. The real answer is because they're made with lots of butter and just a few flies. That's just a joke. They don't use that much butter. For those of you who want your money's worth, we can go into the long version of Geopolitics of Oil. But before we start, it's always important, I feel, to talk about how we decide certain information is true, and how to discard fake news. And this is the approach that scientifically trained doctors use. It is supported by the best evidence. It is based on reason with plausible underlying mechanisms operating within its framework. It is internally and externally consistent. For example, when Charles Darwin looked at the different finches with their different beaks in Galapagos Island, he postulated that they were naturally selected to their environment by some kind of mechanism, and this was externally consistent with things like the fossil record, and ultimately, the means of inheritance by genes was understood, and then mechanism was defined according to random mutation. So it has to be, any sort of scientifically plausible theory has to be also internally and externally consistent. It offers the best explanation for the situation. It may provide useful predictive value for future outcomes. This is what we in the medical field call a prognosis, can offer a prognosis. And acting on that paradigm, acting on that diagnosis provides the best chance of enabling a desired outcome. So if you can't make a proper diagnosis, you can't define a management plan, and your results are no better than chance, or could be detrimental. So starting with the critical criteria by which we decide information is true, and it has to be, of course, on the basis of validated facts, historical facts. Let's proceed. There's a lot of stuff to go through. There are a lot of references, but if there's just one person you wish to read or listen to his interviews or listen to his podcast, it would be Michael Clare. Professor Michael Clare is a professor of history at Hampshire University in the US, and he specializes in petropolitics. And he spoke out against things like the Iraq War and many of the other morally bankrupt foreign policies of certain countries. In your list over here, in this handout, there's a whole heap of names with various authors and researchers that you can refer to. They've got a lot of stuff on the web. How do we unpack this whole thing? There's a few ways, but when we consider geopolitics, it is just one aspect of the many components which are threatening to unravel our industrial civilization. And I think because even though it's very wide-ranging what we're going to talk about today, it only represents one small part of the multiplicity of considerations we have to take into account. So I've devised a three-dimensional dynamic system model, which I'll refer to briefly. We'll also go through the importance of petroleum. You're all familiar with it, but just a quick review. Then I will be asking these three questions, which the author of Ronald Wright, he evoked Paul Gauguin's painting from Tahiti. Ronald Wright, in his book, in his introduction, A Short History of Progress, asked these questions: D'où venons-nous, que sommes-nous, où allons-nous? Which literally means where are we from, what are we, and where are we headed? Which I'm going to paraphrase into how did we get here, where are we now, and where are we headed? The first two questions I attempt to answer together: how did we get here, and where are we now? By explaining certain important concepts. European colonialism before World War II, particularly the concept of divide and rule. U.S. neo-colonialism after World War II, and they adopted a hierarchy of tactics, which I've mentioned in that slide. There, we'll get into that later. We need to also, one of the key concepts is how the petrodollar came about and what it means for the running of our industrial societies. And in order to understand that, we have to define a lot of other things, go back to basics, define what is money, what is the economy, what is finance, and so forth. And by making those definitions and understanding how banks behave and how the neoliberal economists have shaped things according to the wishes of certain vested interests, we can understand how certain financial parasites are able to funnel wealth from the public domain into their private coffers by certain tactics. And finally, we will look at where we are headed, and we need to discuss a few things which I can only go into very briefly. The declining energy return over energy invested of conventional oil and the futility of unconventional oils, the current Saudi shenanigans being pursued by this character Mohammed bin Salman, who is also along with certain U.S. chickenhawks, wants to bomb Iran, and moved by the BRICS countries to overturn the petrodollar, which are currently in motion and will inevitably cause the U.S. economy to collapse. So obviously the U.S. will resist these measures tooth and nail, and the question is, will the U.S. provoke war, which could lead to World War III in response? So firstly, I'd like to start with this overview. So this is my three-dimensional model. I think let's actually show it in 3 dimensions with this video clip first. I call this video clip Doom Explained by Confectionery Abuse. So this central figure is the total human footprint, which is total human population multiplied by individual consumption and pollution. And at the corners of this six-sided double pyramid, in this XY plane, we have the components of eco-destruction, resource depletion, and climate change. And at the apices, we have pollution here, and just one component is human shenanigans, which I would describe as the politics, economics, finance. Now, the thing is, the limits to growth scientists try to look at all of these things quantitatively, but one thing you cannot look at quantitatively is human irrationality, the politics, the geopolitics, finance, economics, and so forth. But it is very important that we put it into our considerations, because it is this human irrationality which can destroy civilization, nuclear war, just as easily as any of the other things like climate change or ecosystem destruction. So that's it in 3 dimensions. So I define geopolitics as the actions by and interactions between nation states, which I assert are motivated mainly by the pursuit of wealth and power. Power mainly being industrial, economic, and especially military power. Of course, every state which exerts its power likes to portray itself as some kind of, benevolent force, which is almost always bogus. And the way they control the minds of the people they exploit is through their media and through the exertion of cultural strength. So how did all of this start? If there was any sort of particular turning point beginning in which petroleum assumed its prime importance in the considerations of politics of countries, it would have probably been in 1911, when Winston Churchill, the young Winston Churchill, was the First Lord of the Admiralty in the UK, and he witnessed this event in the port of Agadir in Morocco, where there was a dispute between the Germans and the French, and the Germans blockaded the port with these two coal-fired ships. And technology was advancing to the extent by then that Churchill realized that that Britain had to convert the entire fleet to petroleum-powered vessels, because petroleum as a fuel and the internal combustion engine was vastly superior to anything that the coal-powered ships could do. Their range was hugely greater, their speed was greater, maneuverability was greater, they could run circles around the Germans. So from that moment onwards, Britain decided, okay, everything's going to be petroleum powered. But there was just one problem. Britain had plenty of their own coal, but had none of their own petroleum. So where would they obtain their petroleum from? Well, it was well known to them that one of the richest sources of petroleum was Persia, before it became known as Iran. And so by means of the Anglo Petroleum Oil Company, APOC, which later came to be known as British Petroleum, they proceeded to obtain their petroleum from Persia, and this set the stage for a lot of other things to follow as time went by. But obviously Germany realized the same thing. In order to achieve a more sort of advanced military, they had to convert to the internal combustion engine powered by petroleum as well. In fact, the diesel engine was invented by a German, Rudolf Diesel. And they had set their sights on Iraq, in fact. And they were building this railway direct from Berlin to Baghdad. And this alarmed the British. So there are people who say that World War I was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Serbia. Well, maybe, but the real reason certain historians assert that Britain actually sort of went all into World War I was to deny the Germans access to Iraqi oil. And in fact, they were successful in doing that. And also, they had designs on the Ottoman Empire, which was very weak. It was falling apart internally by then, naturally. All of that has major consequences for what's happening in the world today. World War I was the first militarized war, rendered horse-mounted cavalry completely obsolete. World War II was completely petroleum-powered. And apart from nuclear submarines or aircraft carriers, everything now, we have no substitute for petroleum. And those supersonic fighter jets without petroleum, they're just sort of glorified paperweights. They're utterly useless. Somebody described petroleum as liquid hegemony, and I think that's quite an apt description. So it is absolutely indispensable. We have no substitute. It's absolutely indispensable for military power. But it also powers everything else: our agriculture, mining, and transportation of all commodities from the hinterland to the city, construction, and of course, it runs our satanic mills of industry as well. So that's the importance of petroleum. So going on to this question. How did we get here, and where are we now? So let's talk about one specific concept related to the European colonialism before World War II. So this colonization and there's colonialism. So what's the difference? Well, colonization is if you look at land, real estate, which is particularly desirable, nice climate, fertile soil, and you want to settle there. So you go in there, you invade, and you replace the indigenous population, and you kill them, you marginalize them to reservations. That's colonization, you know, like bacteria colonizing a petri dish. But what's colonialism? Well, you know, if a country is, you know, like a tropical jungle, pestilent place full of malaria, I don't want to live there, but it's got resources that I want. So let's send your sort of knuckle-dragging troops into that country to secure the area, and you can then extract whatever labor resources from that colony. And one of the key concepts was divide and rule. Now everybody knows the idea, the concept behind divide and conquer. Divide and conquer is very simple. Divide and conquer means you look at that desirable territory, there are warring tribes, you arm all sides of the tribes, let them kill each other off, and when there's just one man standing and they're exhausted and decimated, then you can go in with your superior weaponry, easily defeat that last guy. So that's divide and conquer a territory. But divide and rule, not many people understand this idea about divide and rule, and this was taught to me by a professor of history, Professor Sarvadaman Singh, and he said the ideal ratio is 15%, 85% for colonial territory. How does this work? You find that it could be 10%, 20%, but ideally maybe 15% minority group that you give privileges to. You preferentially educate them. You put them in positions of administration in the army and the police, and give them weapons, not as good as yours, the colonial master, but weapons which are superior to the rest of the 85% rabble. And that minority group, that 15%, is used to control that 85%. It worked fantastically well. Of course, this was an assertion made by Professor Singh, and you know, as a member of the audience, it is your role to double-check any assertions made by any speaker. So I looked into it, and in fact, you can find examples of this everywhere. Just looking, for example, at Rwanda. So Rwanda is a small, landlocked African country, the first European power to colonize it, not colonize, but render it a colonial possession was Germany in 1884. But their possession of Rwanda was short-lived because World War I supervened, the Germans lost. So who took over that territory? It was the Belgians. So when the Belgians took over Rwanda, but they had seen what the Germans had started and they basically amplified it. What had the Germans started? Well, who were the people in Rwanda? It was about 15% Tutsi and 85% others, mostly Hutu. What was the difference between Tutsi and Hutu? Actually, not a lot. They spoke the same language. They couldn't tell each other apart. It was mainly an economic division. The Tutsi were the royalty and the upper class. The Hutu were the proletariat. And you could actually become, if you were a Hutu, you could actually become a Tutsi by means of economic advancement. So that was the situation originally. But the Germans capitalized on it, and they were obsessed with race, and they said, oh, they're actually separate races, and actually the Tutsi have like straighter noses, and the Hutu have wider noses. But if you have a flat, wide nose, but you happen to have lots of cattle, you can be regarded as a Tutsi. So they were kind of, even though they were race-obsessed, but they were flexible with their racial obsession. So what did the Belgians do? They inherited the situation, and it worked well if you used the Tutsi to control the Hutu, but they tried to formalize everything. So what they did was they preferentially educated the Tutsi in French Catholic schools and gave them positions in administration, police, army, and they not only control the rest of Hutu. They committed all sorts of abuses, give people a little bit of power and, it goes to the head. So they committed all sorts of terrible abuses against the Hutu, who obviously resented the Tutsi. Obviously a Tutsi would be determined to hold on to power because they were in a privileged position, secure employment, superior income, also what would happen if they lost the position is they would face reprisals from the Hutu. So this is how colonialists control people in their colonies. The other thing that the Belgians did was they decided that from around 1926, they decided that Hutu and Tutsi have to have identity cards stating who they are, because they can't really tell each other apart from appearance, so it would be stamped forever. So no longer was there social mobility. If you're Hutu, you can become a Tutsi. It's stamped on your identity card, you're one or the other, and that's it forever. But the Belgians eventually left Rwanda in the 1960s, and prior to their departure, they thought, oh well, let's try and undo some of these divisions. So they actually put Hutus into positions of power, and then the Belgians left. But what would happen after that? Well, it's natural that the Hutus, after many decades of resentment, then sort of started attacking the Tutsis, and again there was terrible conflict, and a lot of Tutsis had to flee the country and were sort of lobbying reprisals against the Hutu from other neighboring countries. And now this sort of went on for a while, but the other thing that happened as the decades went by was an increasing population within Rwanda. So in around 1934, the population was maybe 1.6 million, and by 1989, the population of Rwanda was 7.1 million. So 7.1 million occupying the same small territory. Obviously, the result is reduction in resources per capita, which in other words means poverty and competition for resources, and ongoing, resentments of the Hutu against the Tutsi historically, which then flared up in the final solution in the 1990s as genocide. So basically the Hutu killing about 1 million Tutsi and some revenge killings of the Tutsi against the Hutu. So that was the legacy of colonialism. Now, what has this got to do with petroleum? Well, actually quite a lot, because this same kind of contrived... now, this was a natural division, 15%, 85% in Rwanda. But what happens if you want to control territories which don't have this natural 85%? Well, you engage in some kind of gerrymandering kind of thing. You contrive the borders so that you create a situation where there's this artificial state where 15% is a minority and you use them to control the majority. And this has happened in both Iraq and Syria. So these are all contrived borders. So in Iraq, the minority group were used by Britain and the US to control the majority. The minority were Sunni, and the majority were others, most of whom were Shiite. And what about Syria? In Syria, the minority used to control the majority were Alawite Shiites, and the majority were a bunch of others, but mostly Sunni Muslims, so the other way around. And how did this come about? Well, this came about towards the end of World War I in 1916. You may have heard of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. It wasn't really a treaty, it was something just, well, maybe it was a treaty between the British and the French. I mean, Sykes was British and Picot was French. They were just sort of minor functionaries who absolutely had no clue about the nature of the Middle East, the alliances, the conflicts between different groups. But the Ottoman Empire was in its last legs, and Britain and France wanted to have their own piece of the pie. So these two ignoramuses just drew straight lines and said, okay, this will be British mandate, this will be French mandate, without knowing anything whatsoever. Who were the British people who actually understood the geopolitical situation in that vicinity? There were a few. The two ones who are quite well known in history in this photo. T. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia, and Gertrude Bell. They were fluent Arabic speakers. They could read and write Arabic, and they dressed in the local fashion, and they spoke with the local people and understood the sentiments of the locals. And in fact, they tried their very best, because they had a love for the Arabs. They tried their very best as the Ottoman Empire fell, to try and shape the subsequent states according to the wishes of the local people. So I'd just like to read something out. This is from Gertrude Bell's wiki page, 1921 Middle East Conference. Bell and Lawrence were among a select group of Orientalists convened by Winston Churchill to attend a 1921 conference in Cairo to determine the boundaries of the British Mandate and nascent states such as Iraq. Gertrude is supposed to have described Lawrence as being able to ignite fires in cold rooms. Throughout the conference, she and Lawrence worked tirelessly to promote the establishment of the countries of Transjordan and Iraq, to be presided over by the kings Abdullah and Faisal, sons of the instigator of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Until her death in Baghdad, she served in the Iraq British High Commission Advisory Group. Bell opposed the Zionist movement. On the grounds that it would be unfair to impose Jewish rule on Arab inhabitants in Palestine. She wrote that she regarded the Balfour Declaration, so that was basically fine-tuning the Sykes-Picot boundaries to suit the minority-majority boundaries and providing a homeland for Jews in Israel. She regarded the Balfour Declaration with the deepest mistrust, and that it's like a nightmare in which you foresee all the horrible things which are going to happen and can't stretch out your hand to prevent them. Very, very prescient words. Mark Sykes, the British diplomat responsible for the Sykes-Picot treatment, was not fond of her. After the defeat of the Ottomans in World War I, France and Britain set the stage for the immense troubles to follow. Until it was dismembered, the vast region known for centuries as Bilad al-Sham, or the lands of Damascus, or Greater Syria, which included Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, included the future Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Against the wishes of its inhabitants, who vehemently opposed the Sykes-Picot Treaty and demanded a united Syria-Palestine, France took Syria and Lebanon, and Britain occupied Jordan and Palestine. The partition of Lebanon as a separate country also limited Syrian access to the Levantine coast, an echo of the Iraq-Kuwait partition, although not necessarily restricting for Syria. So what do I mean by that? So you can see here this contrived country of Iraq, and right down here where you'd think it should naturally be part of Iraq, which happened to have a high concentration of giant oil fields, is another state called Kuwait. And all you have for Iraq to access the Persian Gulf is a tiny strip of land, a tiny corridor. Of course, sea access is very important if a country is to gain ascendancy in terms of economic and military power, and having an artificial state there to minimize their access is one way of restricting them. And similar here, but not quite as bad in Syria. So these are the current boundaries that we find ourselves in. And what are the populations? So Syria, 2012, Alawite Shiites, 12%, and the rest, 87%, the majority of whom are Sunni Arabs. This is a bit difficult to read, but here we see in Iraq, the Sunni Arabs are the minority, and obviously Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Arab, about 19%, and the rest were other tribal or ethnic affiliations, the majority of whom are Shia or Shiite Arabs. So when you contrive states in this very artificial manner, rather than allowing the natural tribes to live among their own, you set up a powder keg. As I said, the over the decades, you build up a resentment of the majority against the minority who have been given privileges that they don't deserve. You're setting up a powder keg state. The only way you can hold these states together is by having a monarchy or a brutal dictator. Because if you have democracy, then the majority will then come to the ascendancy and run the countries, which is not at all what the colonial powers wanted. The colonial powers wanted to control everyone through their proxies who would be a minority in that country. So when, you know, US and other countries bemoan the existence of brutal dictators in those countries, I mean, ask yourself, who were responsible for setting that up in the first place? Come on. So let's move on to, so we talked about European colonialism before World War II. Let's talk about US neocolonialism after World War II. And this is well described by John Perkins in this book here. And there are basically 4 ways they go about things. Step 1, let's see if the existing leaders are corruptible and bribe them. So that would be the example of the Saudis, for example. And if that doesn't work, then you pursue regime change. And there are 3 ways by which you pursue regime change. You astroturf revolution, as in the case of Iran, or you assassinate the leaders, as in the case of multiple leaders in Latin America, or you invade the country, which is the method of last resort. It's preferable to do things according to proxy invasion, but you know, U.S. will invade them directly if they have to. And occasionally all those tactics fail, such as in Cuba. So this is a very, very important piece of history. Have all of you heard of Mohammad Mossadegh? Mohammad Mossadegh? Okay, so in 1951, Iran, the former Persia, voted in, by democratic election, free and fair democratic elections, they voted in Mohammad Mossadegh as their prime minister. And what he wanted to do, he wanted to nationalize the oil, he wanted to gain a greater share of the income of the oil, the fair share, to be obtained for the Iranians, because it was Iranian resource, it was Iranian property. He wanted to build schools, he wanted to build roads, he wanted economic advancement for his people. But, you know, that obviously went entirely against the agenda of Britain, who wanted to get cheap oil from Iran. Now, it's a bit of a complicated story because the people who actually overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh were the CIA. This is not anything that people teach you in school, except maybe Iranian schools. But the thing is, it's such an important piece of history to help you understand the state of the world now. And we know this for a fact. It's on the public record, but certainly no Americans talk about it, that in 1953, Kermit Roosevelt, Kermit's a real name, Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, Kermit was an employee of the CIA, was given a few $1 million by CIA to go into Tehran and destabilize the government by any means. And he was spectacularly successful. So what he did was, with his few $1 million, he was able to hire crowds, you know, hire gangsters, and create an atmosphere and a fake atmosphere of dissatisfaction among the populace against the prime minister. He bribed newspaper editors to say that Mossadegh was corrupt, that he was a homosexual, that he was all sorts of things which were total lies. And with rent-a-crowd, he was able to get the revolution going on the streets. So this is what we call astroturfing. This is astroturfing before astroturf was invented. Astroturfing is the artificial creation of a grassroots revolution within a country. So they ended up deposing Mossadegh, and the US installed Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was this grandiloquent megalomaniac, full of himself. Here you can see him crowning his wife. Obviously, they regarded themselves as royalty, and he would wear all these military badges on his tunic. And his role was, there was only one important role for him, which is to sell oil cheap to the West, which he did. And use whatever remaining money there was. He kept his population impoverished, and he used plenty of money to buy weapons from the U.S. And the U.S. also wanted him to, because it's a very expensive project, they started to introduce nuclear technology to him so he could build nuclear power stations. So if you ask how on earth did Iran get the beginning of nuclear technology, you have to ask the American establishment, the very people who decry their possession of it. What happened? Well, you know, there was increasing resentment among the populace against the Shah. He was obviously just a puppet of the West, and just through natural resentment, they eventually rose up and got rid of him. But there were many, many different factions in Iran at the time. A lot of the power was, a lot of the motivation to remove him was with university students. But the people who actually gained power, as you know, the figurehead who came back from France to Iran to gain power and was who became the head of state was Ayatollah Khomeini. So in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini took over the reins of Iran, and he adopted Sharia law, Islamic law. So what do we have here? As a result of the U.S. overturning democracy in Iran in 1953 and selling them lots of military equipment, you now have this fundamentalist Islamic state who hates the West and is well armed with plenty of American weapons. So here's an example of blowback, one of the first few examples of blowback. But anyway, there are many, many examples by which the U.S. basically has been stuffing around other countries in the most despicable manner. And the story of Mossadegh must be understood and remembered. So please burn that into your brain. So this is Ayatollah Khomeini. So that was an example of astroturfing. So what about the strategy of assassination? This is actually well covered by John Perkins in his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he had personal experience firstly trying to bribe the leader of Panama, Omar Torrijos. Obviously, Panama was of great economic strategic importance because of the Panama Canal, and he wasn't able to bribe him. And Torrijos, again, was one of those very difficult people who wanted to use the income to serve his people and build schools and hospitals and roads. I mean, that's just absurd. I mean, you've got to get rid of those people. And so the usual strategy is, if the economic hitman fails, they bring in the jackals for assassination, and Torrijos mysteriously died in an aircraft explosion, and the next leader was someone who was happy to do U.S. bidding. And the same thing happened to Jaime Roldos in Ecuador. Again, I mean, he obviously, Perkins had many projects, but these were his failures, and he was happy that they were failures. In fact, he wrote that he had admiration for these men of integrity. So Jaime Roldos, Ecuador had oil, and again, he wasn't going to play the game of the Americans, and he mysteriously died in another aircraft explosion. And just by chance, the next leader of Ecuador was happy to do the bidding of the U.S. The involvement in Latin America actually dates back to even 1953, around the same time as Iran, when Jacobo Arbenz, who was the leader of Guatemala at the time, again he was a leftist and wanted profits from all the agriculture to go back to his own people, and he wasn't going to play ball, and the United Fruit Company of the USA weren't happy with that. So again, the US overturned Arbenz, and then the United Fruit Company was able to have free rein to do whatever they liked in Guatemala. There's another September 11, which not a lot of people may be aware of. Everybody knows about, the tragedy happening to people in New York. But there was an even bigger tragedy which happened to the people in Chile on September 11, 1973. Anybody knows about that or remembers that? September 11, 1973. That was the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile by the CIA proxies. And this again is well documented. You know, at the time, the U.S. can of course claim plausible deniability, and you know, the world was basically clueless at the time as to what was going on. But 30 years after, with the Freedom of Information Act, and also we should be thankful to a Democratic congressman named Frank Church, this historical fact became well known, that the CIA maneuvered to have Allende, again, a leftist socialist leader who wanted to serve his people, ousted. And the Americans claimed that, oh, he committed suicide, shot himself. Well, you know, that's essentially he was assassinated by the Americans. So who took over? The person who took over was Augusto Pinochet. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Chileans suffered under his regime and were disappeared, killed, tortured, thanks to that guy. I mean, going back to Iran, I mean, that same thing also happened to the Iranians because the Shah contrived this secret police called the Savak, and they did the same thing. Any dissenters, they would be rounded up, tortured, killed, disappeared. So here's a slide talking about the School of the Americas. Enough said there. Just an assassination school to educate would-be dictators in Latin America who would then do the bidding of the USA. Now, I'm not trying to be anti-American. I'm just describing the history of what has been happening, and you have to come to your own conclusions. You know, are they supporters of democracy and freedom in the world and free speech? So we go on to this guy. Now this is a photo. Now how did Saddam Hussein come to power? He came to power in 1979 in Iraq in a coup. Now, was that an endogenous coup? I don't know. We just don't have enough information. But the following year, 1980, what did Saddam do? Saddam invaded Iran. Now what did Saddam have to gain from invading Iran? Bugger all. Iran is many times the size of Iraq and had so much military hardware, it would be the most strategically idiotic thing to do. But also we know from historical records that the US poured billions of dollars into Saddam's regime to support this invasion of Iran, which went on from 1980 to 1988. And probably 1 million lives were lost. And it was a terrible tragedy, but it was a stalemate, ended up in a stalemate. But one thing that happened at the end of the Iran-Iraq war was that Iraq was in huge debt, especially to Kuwait, because Kuwait had also been funding this illegitimate war. Now, of course, we know who would have stood to gain if Iraq had been successful, and that would have been regime change in Iran. Now, who could possibly want regime change in Iran to topple Ayatollah Khomeini? You can come to your own conclusion regarding that. Now, was Saddam a proxy of the US? Here's a picture, a video capture frame taken from the meeting between Donald Rumsfeld, then employee of Bechtel, and Saddam Hussein, 1983, and they were selling Saddam Hussein so-called dual-purpose chemical factories. What is dual-purpose? That means you can use your herbicides for your agriculture, or you can use your pesticides for agriculture, or you can use the pesticides to manufacture nerve gas. And guess what? The following year, 1984, Saddam Hussein used nerve gas not only against the Iranians, but against the Kurds in Iraq. But that's all fine, because he was doing America's bidding. He was a brutal dictator. He was using nerve gas, but it doesn't matter. At the time, he was a good friend, so let's not criticize him. He only becomes a bad guy later. So Saddam was in huge debt after the Iran-Iraq war. Kuwait had promised to be funding it, but they demanded payments from him, and he felt he was being squeezed by them, and that they had reneged on a deal. So he decided, well, I'm going to teach those Kuwaitis a lesson. But before he actually invaded Kuwait, he spoke with April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador in Baghdad. He asked her, will the U.S. have any objection from me going into Kuwait? And she said to him, the U.S. has no opinion on the matter. Now, obviously, she wouldn't be just saying it on her own accord. She would have double-checked with George Bush Sr. at the time. So what does that mean, that U.S. has no opinion on the matter if you invade Kuwait? That means that's a green light. So he invaded Kuwait, and guess what? The U.S. decided, oh, we're going to invade Iraq after that. So anyway, we could say that Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, that was when an unelected, morally bankrupt leader of one country invaded another country for their oil on the basis of lies and delusional ideology. Is that a fair description? And the blowback was, U.S. then invaded Iraq. Gulf War I. But they couldn't depose him, they just sort of left things at that. So that brings us to Gulf War II and Bush Jr. using all sorts of bogus excuses for invading Iraq. So Gulf War II we could probably describe as that was when the unelected, morally bankrupt leader of one country invaded another country for the oil on the basis of lies and delusional ideology. And actually, this is true, it's 100% true, that they originally called it Operation Iraqi Liberation, but the abbreviation was just too obvious, so they had to change it to Operation Iraqi Freedom. So this is how they have been spreading democracy. And so you've seen a few examples of U.S. neocolonialism after World War II. And the next, and it's all well documented. I mean, all those examples are just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There have been more than 50 very, very well documented illegitimate interventions by the U.S. and well documented by this author William Blum, among others. And we don't have time to go into that. But Noam Chomsky, and you can look this up, he's got this YouTube interview. Noam Chomsky has also researched this, and he said that all of the U.S. presidents since the 1950s, since World War II, every one of them, if they were to be tried according to the Nuremberg rules, every one of them would actually be regarded as a war criminal. Let's move on to the economy and how petroleum feeds into the economy. But very simply, I mean, the physical fact is that the economy is a subset of our environment, not the other way around, which is how economists think. The economy is a subset of our environment, and economic activities cannot occur without energy. You have to have energy inputs, and the energy inputs of fossil fuels, petroleum in particular, are far superior to anything we have ever encountered in the past, and we don't have any real replacement. But certain economists say, oh, we can decouple the economy from energy, which is just total nonsense. They have no understanding of realities of the world or physics or anything. But in order for us to understand the petrodollar, we need to go back to certain very basic definitions. So what is material wealth. What is money? What is economics? What is finance? So any offers from you guys about the definitions of these things? What is material wealth? So you think about the person who is very wealthy and, you know, they can ride in their private jet, they get the best health care, they eat the best food, stay in the best hotels, best of everything, right? So I define material wealth as having easy access to a wide variety of high-quality goods and services. Is that fair enough? Material wealth, having easy access to a wide variety of high-quality goods and services. What is money?
Why you can't elucidate it? It's the counting device.
Counting device. Any other offers? What is money? Pardon? Tradable currency, yep. It is a proxy for the future delivery of goods and services, right? Wealth is actually based on goods and services. Money itself isn't wealth. But money, if money represents wealth, then you can get wealth through money, right? But money is not an end to itself. It's what money promises. It's a fungible proxy for the future delivery of goods and services. And it is based on trust. And if people lose trust in that money, then that money becomes worthless. If you can no longer trade it for goods and services, if it loses its psychological value, the psychological trust. Yes, places where you get hyperinflation. If it doesn't actually represent anything, then that's it. That's the end of the money. What is economics? Study of scarcity of resources. I would the usual conventional definition of economics is the study of how goods and services are produced and distributed. The study of how goods and services are produced and distributed. And there's big flaws in that conventional definition of economics, because they may count goods, but they don't count the bads. They don't count the bad consequences of delivering and producing those goods and services. Pollution, especially carbon emissions, environmental devastation, displacement of indigenous people. So that is one huge blind spot. Because of the failure of economics to take into account all of these issues, we're headed for basically planetary collapse. But that's the capitalist system for you. And what is finance? It's very simple, finance. Finance is just the way by which economic activities are funded, right? So finance obviously involves money. Finance is the way by which economic activities are funded. And another question, which if you can answer could be potentially life-saving. What is the airspeed velocity of a sparrow? Anybody knows? What's the correct answer to this?
25 miles per hour, 40 kilometers per hour.
The correct answer is it a European sparrow or an African sparrow? So if you answer that, then that could save your life if you ever encounter a Scottish wizard guarding the entrance to a gate over a canyon, a bridge over a canyon. But anyway, let's go into the banking system and how our financial system works. So the modern-day neoliberal capitalist system, the key feature of it is that interest is charged on debt. I think we also have to define what debt is, and it's quite simple, because if I owe you a debt, that means I'm promising to pay you back for something you have loaned me. I'm promising to pay you either in terms of money or future goods and services, right? If I owe you a debt. And the way to secure debt is usually by collateral. And if you fail to secure it by means of collateral, if I can't pay my debt, then the creditor, if they're especially mean-spirited creditor, might say, well then, if I cannot repay the debt in terms of goods, then I will have to repay it in terms of perpetual servitude. And the way debt works, especially compound interest, means that you can actually ensnare people in irredeemable debt, which they will never be able to pay off forever. That's just mathematics. And this has been basically the tactic of capitalist exploitation of other countries, you know, how basically economic hitmen ensnared corruptible leaders of third world countries into irredeemable debt so that their populace would end up in perpetual debt slavery. That has been official US policy. That's how the capitalist system has been working. And so all of this is facilitated by the banking system. And what are the mechanisms by which these financial parasites funnel public wealth into their private coffers? So there's predatory loans. So I talked about how the US might ensnare third world countries in perpetual debt. But they have also been turning inwards in recent years. There's no limit to the amount of greed these people have. So let's take the 2008 financial crisis. So what happened? Basically, from the point of view of the bankers, debt is money. We define money as the promise of future delivery of goods and services, right? Money represents the promise of future delivery of goods and services. But debt, if I owe a debt, I also promise to deliver in future to you either money or goods and services. So from the point of view of the banks, money and debt are exactly the same thing. So when we think of money, it's not just the notes in our wallet, which is only a tiniest fraction of money in a country. The vast majority is in terms of cyber digits in bank accounts, but even greater than that is what's in the share market. And probably the largest fraction of money, so-called money, in any economy is nowadays debt, and it is irredeemable debt because people like Nicole Foss has calculated that the total amount of debt in the world now is more than 100 times what can possibly be redeemed, more than the value of the entire planet, for example. It's all cyber digits. It's all fantasy, which people are playing to the bitter end. So how do these predatory loans work, and why are banks so keen to ensnare people in debt? Because to them, debt is money. So the more loans that they can give out, the bankers then will get greater. They are considered to be performing well, and they get greater bonuses. So they're very keen to get people into debt. And so this is what they were doing with the housing bubble and the so-called ninja loans: no income, no job, no assets. Getting people into loaning people money to buy houses and getting in debt which they could never pay off. And then they called these mortgages, these subprime mortgages, they call them assets. They bundle them together. So these were the collateral debt obligations. But of course, people were wondering, oh, what if they can't be paid off? So they got insurance companies to underwrite them. They called them credit default swaps, and those were bogus, and those were underwritten by so-called AAA rated agencies. Standard & Poor's said, oh, these collateral debt obligations are perfectly fine, but of course they were bogus. So when the whole system collapsed, we had that global financial crisis. And so who suffered with the global financial crisis? Was it the criminal banks who actually sent out these predatory loans? They were bailed out. They were bailed out by the public purse to the tune of something $700 billion. So what does that mean when you use taxpayers' money to bail out the too-big-to-fail banks? That means you're depriving public services of $700 billion worth of assets. That means the roads will then decay, the electrical system will decay, power stations will decay. But so long as the predatory banks are kept solvent, that's the only important thing. And that's how our system works. Now, this is all related to petropolitics. It all feeds in. The stock market Ponzi scheme is also part of this whole system. Everything basically now in the share market is bogus. And you can see that by ridiculous price-earnings ratio. Normally, the price-earnings ratio should be 1-to-1, but now it's like 50-to-1, 100-to-1. They're not actually; those companies aren't actually producing anything which warrants the price of their shares. And this is particularly true for shale oil. Shale oil is the Ponzi scheme which is soon to collapse, and it's only been kept afloat because they have been successively recruiting gullible suckers into it. It does not produce any value that has been put into it. It cannot be kept afloat. So this is the way the economic system works that we have, and you can see, in fact, many examples from the distant past in which all of these bubbles collapsed, going back to, the South Seas scheme when Isaac Newton, the smartest man on the planet, Isaac Newton lost his fortune on the South Seas bubble. And then there was a tulip bubble in Holland, when people were willing to pay the equivalent amount of a house for one tulip bulb. These coin phrases like, irrational exuberance in the market, or animal spirits. John Maynard Keynes called it animal spirits. And this, again, happened in 1929. The stock market was a huge bubble. All of those shares were ridiculously overvalued, and then it suddenly collapsed. But luckily for the US at the time, they had FDR. So Franklin Roosevelt at the time was very active in fact, by modern day standards, he would be regarded by modern day US leadership as an extreme left-wing socialist. But he did what he did in order to basically save Americans and America's economy. He promised the chicken in every pot, and he delivered. But one of the most important things that he did was he quarantined people's personal savings from the operations of the investment banks. Because what happened when they were all mixed together, real money is when you have that promise of real goods and services in the future, but fake money is when a stock is overvalued, but in fact, when in reality, when you examine it, it has no value and it cannot be traded for real goods and services. You need to quarantine the two. And if you want to speculate in ridiculous fantasies, that's fair enough. You lose your money, that's your fault. That's investment banking, which should be quarantined from savings banks, from savings accounts. But they were all mixed together at that time. So people who had been saving for their retirement, they lost everything, even though they themselves weren't speculating in the stock market. So that's why the crash in 1929, Great Depression, affected everybody. So one of the most important pieces of legislation that FDR wrote was Glass-Steagall. So have you heard of the Glass-Steagall legislation? So Glass and Steagall were just sort of minor functionaries in the government who were doing FDR's biddings, and presumably they're among that crowd there. But that's FDR signing it in, I think it was 1934, he signed that. And by doing so, and his various strategies of creating jobs, of building infrastructure, he was quite a Keynesian by actually ensuring the government would devise projects to create infrastructure and create jobs. Millions of jobs he created. He basically saved the US from economic collapse. But the main thing for economic stimulus for the USA was actually World War II. That's when all the industrial production ramped up. Now, it was possible to adopt those Keynesian strategies then because that was a time when America had a small population, had plenty of resources, was a pristine country, they had plenty of oil. The situation now is very, very different, and there's no way we can get ourselves out of the quandary we are in now when the inevitable stock market collapse occurs. After World War II, so I'm getting to the end here. So after World War II, or towards the end of World War II, U.S. emerged triumphant. It was basically untouched, apart from Hawaii, was untouched from any destruction, and they were the industrial powerhouse of the world. So at Bretton Woods in July 1944, various countries got together, and it was basically the U.S. who decided everything. John Maynard Keynes was there, but he didn't really have much of a say. They were deciding on what was going to happen for the future of the world economy, and they decided that the U.S. Currency would be the world reserve currency, and it would be backed up by gold, because the U.S. held 80% of the gold at the time. I mean, a lot of rich Europeans fled Europe and brought the gold along with them. And it led to the establishment of the Global Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, later the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the IBRD, International Bank on Reconstruction and Development, which later became the World Bank. And that was the system that we had, but it came apart. So Bretton Woods was a reasonable idea, but it started coming apart by the late 1960s. And what was happening towards the late 1960s? The U.S. was printing money way beyond its means, and there's no way it could be backed up by the relative pittance of gold that they held compared to the huge amount of money they were printing. The U.S. dollar was losing confidence as a reserve currency. So what could they do? In fact, like the Germans, many other people, they were demanding their gold back because they didn't believe. So they were having a crisis of confidence of the U.S. dollar, and it was a big problem. The U.S. dollar lost its value. So this brings us to one of the most important concepts of all. What is the U.S. petrodollar? What is the U.S. petrodollar? So in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, and the Arabs were handed another spanking by the Israelis, and they were very unhappy about things, but they realized they had this power. As OPEC, they could punish the West, they could punish the US, they could punish Israel. So in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, they decided on an embargo on oil. So at that time, the US had just gone past peak oil production, but they were still producing the vast amount of their own oil domestically. But in order to keep the wheels of industry running at the usual pace, they needed that extra import, that little bit of extra import. And the thing is that minimal shortfall resulted in huge inconvenience to the whole economy, and just about about a 5% shortfall in oil resulted in the price of oil in the US going up by 4 times. So just a little shortfall in supply means a huge price rise, and that's just how the supply and demand and prices work. So after that, Kissinger and Nixon got together, and they devised a tactic, a strategy, a plot so cunning you could put a tail on it and call it a weasel. So what was this? This was the U.S. petrodollar. They went to the Saudi royals, and they gave them an offer that the Saudis could not refuse. They said to the Saudis, listen, you guys agree to sell your oil in US dollars, nothing but US dollars, refuse all other currency. In return, we will guarantee your monarchy remains in power in perpetuity. We will support your monarchy by military and any other means. We will protect you from Israel, the bogeyman of the Middle East, and we will sell you tons and tons of military hardware, and you will be entrenched, all your descendants will be entrenched forever as rulers of Saudi with plenty of money. You just sell it in US dollars, and if you have anything left over from your expenses, you just invest them in our Western banks in US debt securities. So what did this mean? This meant for the US that their dollar was now backed up by oil, and oil is definitely, it's not only a proxy for future delivery of goods and services, it is a real useful commodity which can be used to produce goods and services. Unlike gold, you can't use to produce any stuff. This gave, again, the new legitimacy to the US dollar. It increased the confidence, it increased the value of the US dollar. But what did it also mean? It meant that in order for anybody to buy oil, which every industrial economy needed, they would have to purchase US dollars first. How do you get US dollars? Either through the very, very expensive exchange market, or you manufacture things, you export them to the US, and the US will then give you US dollars. What does that mean for the US? That means all the US has to do is they print the US dollars, and they get free high-quality commodities from overseas for nothing, just for printing it. People don't understand this. Furthermore, they would get oil for nothing. They just print their money, they send it to the Saudis, and they get free oil. So this tactic, the petrodollar they devised, was a stroke of genius. It was a first-class ticket on the richest gravy train of all time. And it also meant that when the Saudis invested in US debt securities, they were underwriting US debt. So the US could just spend and spend like crazy, and it would be underwritten by the Saudi investments. And this is how the US has come to have 800 military bases all around the world, which are all funded by the petrodollar. And this is also why they will do everything in their means to keep protecting the petrodollar, including going to war. And in fact, you could argue that the main reason they went into Iraq to invade Iraq was not because they wanted to secure the oil fields, because it takes a lot of effort, you know, to secure and manage oil fields, and it's just difficult work. But the thing is, Saddam had, just prior to that invasion by the US, Saddam had actually started to sell his oil in euros. So the main agenda was actually to get the Iraqis to sell their oil in euros again, in US dollars. Once they sell in US dollars again, then the petrodollar system works once again in favor of the US. They get free oil, and it doesn't matter who actually owns the oil wells, because it's still free oil for the US. That's how the petrodollar works. In the years since then, the Saudi family have multiplied like rabbits. In fact, in the very beginning, the original king, Ibn Saud, obviously it's hereditary leadership. And do you know how many sons Ibn Saud had? He had 45 sons. So, you know, one of the successors was among the 45. And so it's been going down the line, and there's many thousands of members of the royal family now, every one of them feeding at the trough of oil money. This is not a democracy. This is a country where the royal family sees oil as their own private piggy bank, and they use it. There's no accounting, there's no accountability. They use it to fly to London for their weekend Harrods shopping or whatever. But this cannot continue because they are running out of oil, and we don't know exactly what they have, but it's a lot less than what they claim. I know I'm probably going over time, but I think it's important to explain this in order to understand the shenanigans that they are now adopting. And the guy who seems to be running the show now is not the current king, who's probably quite clueless, but this prince named Mohammed bin Salman, otherwise known as MBS. But before we talk about Saudi oil further, let's go, just a slight segue to say that shale oil, America's claim that they're energy independent and, you know, exporting oil and all that is just a scam. The shale business has not funded itself at any oil price, even $100 a barrel. It could not make ends meet. It is a pure scam. No large oil company has really gone into shale oil, and BHP, who fancied themselves, you know, very smart in mining things, had no clue. And after $13 billion of write-downs, the BHP chairman said the $20 billion US shale investment in 2011 was a mistake. Jacques Nasser said, if we knew what we knew today, we wouldn't do it. Of course we wouldn't do it. So they were taken for suckers. They had no understanding of how the shale system is a scam. We are commonly told that the Saudis have the largest oil reserves in the world. And here's a typical sort of chart to show they've got maybe, I don't know, 4 times, 5 times more than compared to, say, the Russian oil reserves. The problem with oil reserves is that they are largely bogus, and they cannot be depended on, and people use all sorts of definitions, and there's a vast difference between ultimately recoverable resources, technically recoverable resources, economically recoverable resources. The only thing we're interested in is economically recoverable resources. How do you know how much economically recoverable oil resource that country has? What's the best way to make that judgment? Anybody knows? So, pardon? Making profits. I'm talking about in terms of total volume. How do we know the ultimate economically recoverable oil of that country, for example? Pardon? Hubbard curve? Yes, but more specifically, let me ask you another question.
You can't, no one can tell you what it is. You will find out by the school math. When it runs out, it runs out.
Absolutely right. So let me use an analogy. What is the most accurate medical diagnosis? How do you make the most accurate medical diagnosis? Post-mortem. Post-mortem is the most accurate medical diagnosis. How do you know the ultimate recoverable, economically recoverable oil? After they're depleted, then you go back and you use your retrospectoscope. But you can have a rough idea, as Jane says, by looking at the Hubbard curve. So if, for example, two countries have more or less the same sort of profile around peak, you can make a rough judgment that they probably have the same amount of oil reserves. And guess what? Saudi Arabia and Russia have actually more or less, now just because this curve is above this doesn't mean that they have more oil. In fact, the absolute amount of oil in Saudi Arabia or production is actually defined by this space here. It's not from here to the bottom of the x-axis, it's just from here to here. And if you look from here to here, Russia is more or less the same. It's been producing. So you look at, you make a judgment by what they are actually producing and the profile of their curve. So I suspect that, in fact, Saudi Arabia has a lot less. In fact, the past few years, this is a fact, the past few years, Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as the largest exporter of oil in the world. So does that mean actually that Saudi Arabia does not have as much as it claims? There were a lot of reasons why the numbers were inflated, and we know that in the 1980s they made sort of bogus claims. Dune himself showed a picture on his previous presentation that probably more than 80% of the Ghawar oil field is just seawater now. Yes. I've heard sort of on an interview from an oil insider that their water cut is probably about 90%. That means of the fluid coming out of their well, 90% is water. So they are in big trouble, I would say. One of the things I see, yeah, I see, yeah. So one of the things that MBS Mohammed bin Salman was trying to do was to open out an initial public offering to the world. Let's offer the world this grand opportunity to invest in the Saudi oil resources, 5%. They tried to do that in 2016, no takers.
Absolute nonsense.
They tried to do it again, 2018, no takers. And one of the independent analysts, Woods Mackenzie, looked at what's happening there and said, oh, they probably overvalued their oil resources by about 5 times. So nobody believes them. And the thing is, it cannot happen. This IPO cannot happen because in order for the IPO to happen, they have to open their accounting books, they have to open the wells to inspection, and they have to ensure that the royal family doesn't treat all the oil money as a personal piggy bank, and they're not willing to do any of that. They just want people to pay a certain amount that they ask for to own 5% of their oil resources without actually justifying anything that they say before their investors. So obviously nobody, there are no takers. But anyway, we can see here, it's more or less when the oil depletes, it's more or less a symmetrical curve. But this is when you have an open system. What I mean by an open system is if you can get energy from elsewhere to keep extracting oil from your oil wells, you get and this is just gross output, then you get a more or less symmetrical curve. But if you have a closed system, and the world is a closed system, the USA alone is an open system in the sense that it can get energy from outside and then it can extract more oil from its domestic fields. But the world as a whole is a closed system. If you have a closed system, then this is what your actual curve looks like. You have to look at the net energy curve, which is a cliff. It is not symmetric. So this is actually from David Murphy, who had done the ERO-EI calculations. But if you superimpose the export land model on top of that, you actually get another curve in terms of oil available for export, and it terminates around here. Now, these timelines are obviously not absolute, because it also depends on what the actual amount of economically recoverable oil in the world is, and we just don't know that. But the physics of this, the mathematics of this, is irrefutable, that past the peak of oil production, we have to look at net oil production. We have to consider carefully energy return over energy invested, and we face a steep cliff. And it may be all over by 2025. Who knows? It's hard to say. We don't have the exact figures. What has Mohammed bin Salman been up to? So when he first came to prominence, the first thing he did was he placed a lot of the members of the royal family and various other power players in Saudi establishment under house arrest in a luxury hotel. And this is, I think it's a reasonable thing to do if you're a would-be despot. You know, you need to, you put the heavy hand on them and you tell them, look, you sign over your assets to me, then I won't sort of imprison you, I won't do bad things to your family, and then you go on your way. So this is consolidation of power. So if you're a would-be despot worth his salt, this is a natural thing that you would do. Now, everybody was lauding him for overturning the ban on cinemas, and people were saying, oh, he's increasing the freedoms in Saudi Arabia, and he allowed women to drive. So it all sounded really good until you actually understand that there's very real economic reasons why they cannot afford women not driving anymore. I mean, having to employ chauffeurs, having to house and feed those chauffeurs. It's just not economic. The thing that really convinces me that he's not that interested in human rights is this fact. If he allowed women to drive and he was being more liberal, then those women who previously campaigned to be allowed to drive, who were then arrested and imprisoned, because this law no longer applies, they should be set free. But he has kept them in prison. He has kept these activists in prison. So he is basically a totalitarian dictator, and this is evidenced by a lot of other things. His funding of proxy forces in Syria, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. His dispute with Qatar was very strange, but again, because they're both Sunni Arab states, but it requires, sort of more in-depth explanation. But he did all sorts of nasty things to Qatar, including blockading it, banning flights to and from Qatar, and demanding that Al Jazeera be disbanded, all sorts of absurd things. And I talked about the IPO of 5% of Aramco. And then there was this odd dispute with Justin Trudeau, just in August this year, when Trudeau and Canadian politicians were concerned that certain activists, human rights activists within Saudi Arabia, might face a death penalty, and they voiced that. So in response, MBS did all sorts of weird things, like not just attacking Trudeau verbally, but banning flights to and from Canada, closing the Canadian embassy in Riyadh, demanding that, and also closing the Saudi embassy in Ottawa, and also he demanded that the many thousand, I think it's something like 20,000 Saudi students studying in Canada immediately come back to Saudi Arabia, which would be hugely detrimental to those students. So this was like sort of petulant, immature behavior, just because he was being criticized, and you know, from our point of view, he was being validly criticized. But this is the behavior of MBS. And then, of course, the atrocities now being committed in Yemen, which the United Nations themselves said, you know, bombing of children in their school buses and marketplaces, all from, you know, the military hardware that the Saudis purchased from America. They're now sort of completely destroying Yemeni society, and the UN's described them as, you know, basically war crimes. And this is all courtesy of Mohammed bin Salman, who I think I can legitimately describe as a psychopathic jackass. But this is the ally of the USA, which is also being run by a psychopathic jackass. What is the definition of fascism? Fascism. So it was Mussolini himself who created the word fascism. He defined it originally as the merging of the state and the corporation. And he also said that a more accurate word would be corporatism. This was a definition in Webster's dictionary until 1987, when a corporation bought Webster's and changed the definition to exclude any mention of corporations. What are the other characteristics of a fascist state? And I think you will agree with me when I list these criteria. Anti-democratic authoritarian dictatorship, ultra-nationalism, hyper-militarism, racism, and xenophobia. Fair enough? Yeah. And by all these criteria, Nazi Germany was a fascist state, and the Nazis would have agreed with that label. So, are there any parallels today? The Italians called Mussolini Il Duce, which I believe in Italian means the Duke. So what are the characteristics of present-day USA? We see the de facto merger of the corporations with the state. I mean, you know, Donald Rumsfeld, Bechtel, Revolving Door, Halliburton and Cheney, and so forth. There is de facto anti-democratic authoritarian dictatorship. There is no democracy in the USA. And I think it's important to understand, like, if there had been a popular vote, who would be president now? It would be Bernie Sanders. And who prevented Bernie Sanders from being the Democratic nominee? It was the Democrats. It was the DNC, the Democratic National Congress. They have superdelegates. Each superdelegate who would represent corporate interests, they have thousands of votes, 2,000, 3,000, and they overwhelm the popular vote of the people. And that's why Bernie Sanders did not make it as a nominee. If you control who the nominees are, and you have only two parties, so one or the other is president, if you control who the nominees are, and either nominee eventually does the bidding of the corporations, you do not have democracy. So for America to portray itself as democracy is completely bogus. They have, in fact, an authoritarian dictatorship. Whatever the people want is not listened to. You know, if they want gun control, forget about it. It's the NRA corporations whose decisions are more important. Ultranationalism, hypermilitarism, they all speak for themselves, racism, xenophobia. So I say if the shoe fits, you know the rest. So I believe, Trump we can probably describe as il douche, which in American I believe means the diseased douchebag. Einstein said the war after the next will be fought with sticks and stones. I was asked to give you some optimistic commentary. I can with another separate presentation. But basically, we're not going to see any, I think, change in the system which are controlled by vested interests. And we have to do the change ourselves. And there are many, many things we can do, and doing is a living example of what can be done. We have to take the reins of our future into our own hands. I won't go into Syria and natural gas. It's another talk completely. Thanks for bearing with me.